My name is William Pearson. I'm a professor of biology at the University of Louisville, and I've been here since 1975. Before then, I was 5 years in North Texas at North Texas State University, and consider myself a fishery biologist, I guess. A fishery biologist is somebody who studies fish populations that are useful to human beings. But lately, I've gotten away from being a fishery biologist and become more of a ichthyologist, I guess you would say, somebody who just studies fishes because they're fun to study. The older you get, the more freedom you have to do what you want to do instead. Well, when I came here in '75, the Water Resources Lab that I worked for at that time had a contract to do the environmental impact statement for the Trimble County power plant that LG&E built up in Trimble County at that time. And so right away we got into going in over Ohio, or the Ohio up there, I should say, and doing work. And then we later got a contract to do the impact statement on the navigation system changes they were making to the lower Ohio River. So we went down to the Paducah area and did a lot of work on the Ohio River. And my part of it was mainly surveying fishes and surveying larval fishes. So I had students looking at fish larvae in the river and how power plants were going to affect fish larvae. I've always liked going on the river myself. I have owned boats in the past. I don't own one now, but I've always enjoyed taking my family out on 18 Mile Island for picnics and looking for Indian artifacts and things like that. So I had a good amount of experience on the river. I worked in coordination with Orsanco too, in Cincinnati, the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission. And I wrote, and Louis Crumples and I wrote in 1980, I think it was, a overview of the fishes of the Ohio River for them. A nice thick book that has been cited a lot since then. Nice. But that's mainly my contributions. Oh, yeah, it has changed. It's gotten better, actually, and I think I can say that pretty safely. Actually, most of the change for the better came just before I got here, because the Clean Water Act of 1968, well, there were a series of Clean Water Acts in the 1960s and 70s, and those, along with some earlier acts, had caused communities on the Ohio River to change the way they treated their sewage a lot. And the nadir, the worst of the Ohio River's history, I'm sure, was in the early 50s, 1950s, late 40s, early 50s. And it's hard for people today to believe this when you tell them. I have many students look at me like, no, I don't think that could have been true. But in 1948, there was no sewage treatment. Period. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Period. Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, Paducah, all had straight pipes. Right into the river. Out into the river. That was it. No treatment, nothing. And then they began to put in primary treatment when that became so gross. And then with federal help and the federal government, these largely with the help of the federal government, these big cities putting at least primary and secondary treatment plants in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And that's when the river really improved a lot. You will hear even today many people in Louisville say, oh, I wouldn't go swimming in the Ohio River, or I wouldn't do this or that in the Ohio River. And I took my kids wading in the Ohio River. We didn't swim much because it is kind of a dangerous place to swim in big places. But we waded in the water, and I don't mind getting splashed on me and so forth. And we never had trouble because it's been cleaned up a great deal. And so things really improved. And you saw that in the fish community, too. That was the purpose of our 1980 publication on the fishes. It was the history of the fish communities of the Ohio River. And the worst places were in the upper river, of course, right below Pittsburgh, where there was a lot of industry. And then the river gradually got better all the way down to its mouth. And that's even true today. But in the Pittsburgh area, Ray Crumbles, my predecessor, showed some really interesting things. So in 1959, there was a very serious steel strike that lasted for, I think, 7 or 8 or 9 months. They were out of work, and all the steel plants shut down in Pittsburgh. Of course, there aren't any steel plants in Pittsburgh now, but there were a bunch then, and they were all on the Ohio River, and all of them dumping all their waste in the Ohio River untreated. And when they shut that industry down for 9 months in the strike, Louis and his people were up there, and fish came back into the Ohio River, and they saw fish that they hadn't seen in 20 years, because they were wading the tributaries, and as soon as the river waters improved enough, they came out of the tributaries and migrated in, and were there. So, and things have improved a lot since too. Some fishes disappeared, although surprisingly few. Only about 4 or 5 fishes ever disappeared from the Ohio River because of pollution. And recently, there have been some definite improvements in the fish community. Pollution-tolerant species have come back, and pollution-intolerant species have disappeared from many of the lob chain samples that are sent. Well, I think some of our biggest industries were in years ago the meatpacking industries that were on the lower part of Beargrass Creek, and they were pretty bad, I understand. But that had all been essentially cleaned up by the time I got there, so I never saw that. Like, for example, barge traffic. One of the things that people in rural areas along the river complain about all the time is bank erosion. And obviously bank erosion is a part of the natural system. The Ohio River is wandering back and forth across its floodplain just like every other river all through its existence. And you can only do that by eroding the bank. So we know that's not new. And if you read even pioneer accounts of the 1820s and before of what the Ohio River was like, they always mention how during freshets, as they call them, the river was muddy, got very muddy. Well, yeah, of course it did, because it's rerouting itself, and you do that by moving stuff, and you move stuff by suspending the water column. So, but the Corps of Engineers has altered that, what happens there, considerably, their dam operations. And so people who have a nice piece of land, a nice field, usually a soybean field or cornfield usually, next to the river, see feet of it slipping away into the river every year. And they, of course, locally they object to that because you can see why I would too. And now it appears that used to be that one person's loss was another person's gain. But now it appears that there's no gain back, because the Corps is keeping the channel where it is, and the channel just kind of spreading out, or not the channel, but the width of the river itself is kind of spreading out. And like I say, the Corps wants everything to be one deep V for the boats, and get that water in the flood through there as fast as possible. That's what the Corps, those are the two main things that the Corps has in mind, mostly for boats. Yeah, there are other interests that should be taken into account. And they are being, I think, more and more all the time. The Corps of Engineers is a popular whipping boy locally because they're visible, and obviously they're doing stuff, and they're affecting the river in a big way. The Corps of Engineers does what it's told to do, like every other government agency. And I went to a meeting one time it was in Denver, where the commander of the Army Corps of Engineers, General somebody or other, I forgot, green suit person, and was there. And this was it would have been about 1980 or there, in the middle of the environmental movement. And their funds were being cut at that time. And he said, this was an environmental meeting, we were trying to inform him about things that we were doing in cooperation with the Corps. And he gave the opening address and said that the Corps would be willing to do environmental work if they give them the money and the mission. If they can do engineering, like what he had in mind was rehabilitating damaged areas, like they're trying to do with the Everglades, for example, or the Kissimmee River, know about that. And he said they, we're not an anti-environmental agency per se. We do what we're told to do, and what you give us funds to do, and what you, society, tells us to do. And if you want us to make it easy for barge traffic, we'll do that. If you want us to make it better for fish and wildlife, we'll do that. Just tell us what we want. And they do hire biologists, and they have their own biologists on staff, and they do some work like that. In society, I think what our job is talk about the big we society. Our job is to do that, give our agents that we hire a clear mission and the means to do it. And if there's conflict between them, like there's sometimes conflict between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Corps of Engineers, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe that's the way we work out. You know, what is it that society as a whole wants? You know, do they really want to shut down barge traffic? I kind of doubt it. And do they really want barge traffic to take precedence over everything else? No, I kind of doubt that too. So these agencies are kind of useful. Yeah, I tell you one that is a pet peeve of mine, and that is people spray poisons all over the place. And I had a doctoral student a few years back, more like 20 probably, but she was interested in knowing what areas of the county were had the most toxic runoff water. It's well known that when we have a dry spell and it rains, the first flush off the water, the first water that shows up in the gutter, is the worst. Because obviously you've been accumulating all these dry toxins, and as soon as the water hits, and then if you let them flow down the sewers and out into the river, and then wait 2 hours in the rainfall and sample the water again, it's not nearly as bad. It's raining, but worse stuff is gone. So she wanted to see where the first flush toxic material was most toxic. So she set up a sampling program all around the county in various kinds of neighborhoods, residential, industrial, the hospital parking lot downtown, all kinds of places like that. And she got samples as soon as it started to rain with the help of other graduate students, and she got in the lab and tested the toxicity on little fathead minnow larvae, which is the standard way to do it. And she found some surprising things, that runoff in industrial areas could be pretty bad. Down in Rivertown Lakes was a subdivision of big houses next to Oxmoor Shopping Center, and that's because those people all had lawn care services, and they come around and spray those people's lawn as often as they can get away with it, I think, to make money. And if that's 4 times a year, fine. If it's 6 times a year, they'll be happy to do it 8 times a year if you want them to, or as many times a year. They'll do it every week if you want them to. They're happy to do it. And some other people want it because they think, I want my grass to look better than my neighbor's. It's really important to get all that fertilizer and herbicide on there, and they do it. And the runoff from those lawns it's really nasty stuff, really, really toxic. So that's the sort of thing that I think just reducing the intentional spraying and release of nasty material would go a long way. So you don't have to have a lawn that looks like AstroTurf at the football stadium, for God's sakes. Dandelions are pretty. Have a few dandelions in there. They could add a little yellow to the green, You should see my lawn. If I live out in Shelby County, where my neighbors probably not appreciate this conversation. But that's one thing you could do. We could stop using pesticides locally and try to plant more trees, green roofs, all of that sort of thing. I think would be a real boon to the Ohio River. And getting control over illegal dumping and cleaning up. They have these river sweeps every year, where you go out and clean up all the trashes. Well, where do people think that trash comes from? It doesn't. It's when the river rises and goes into the flooded low-lying areas, and that's where it picks up all that stuff. It isn't people throwing trash into the river, things like that. And so we need to go find out where those illegal dumping sites are and clean them up. That's what we should do. That would help a lot for the visual. It wouldn't change the water quality a whole lot, I don't think, at this stage, but it would visually. I've had a lot of experience with the falls. I've had some of my students do their work at the falls, and I think I influenced the way the Corps treats the falls a little bit, although they would deny that probably, and say they did it all on their own. Years ago, in the summertime, when the river was getting low, and they were, they close the dams, shut off all the roller gates. The dams leak a little bit, and they can't control that, and they lose some water through the locks all the time. But when it gets really low in the summertime, they like to close the dams off and hold the water in the pools to have enough depth for the boats. And that usually happens in May every year, or maybe early June. And when they close this upper dam up here, where the falls is, they close it down, and they stage it down in 1 foot intervals on a single gate. And finally they've got 1 foot of water running out of one gate, and now they've got to close it off. If they just chop it like that, it leaves suddenly all those pools and the rocks down the stream are dewatered almost, within 10 minutes or so. And a lot of fish get trapped in there. And have you ever been there and seen that, or seen the results of it? Yeah. And so those fish die, of course. And I say a lot of fish. It sometimes was as much as 10,000 fish, or something like that, which isn't a big deal actually for the Ohio River. But it looks bad, and sometimes it smells bad. And it's a bad policy. You don't have to kill fish if you don't need to. So I had a student studying that, and at the same time there were commercial fishermen fishing that had been grandfathered in. And so that study was kind of interesting because we convinced the Corps that all they had to do was just don't chop it off. Just trickle it off, very slowly, and give the fish a half an hour to go downstream. And I was surprised how resistant they were to doing that. Apparently just because we've always done it that way, and therefore we're always going to do it that way. Well, why? Why not try something a little different? What's it going to cost you? And I couldn't see the cost of anything. I don't think they could either. Well, to make a long story short, they eventually started doing that, and it was a good thing. It was a good thing. So the falls is a really nice area.